And basically, I've been 20 years in this business, mainly writing, started with C++ code and then moved on to .NET and especially on the Windows platform. One area which most people recognize, which I've done, is the web ATM. If you use a Wells Fargo ATM, this is actually running WPF. I'm not sure how many people listen. I was an architect on this project. So, a little bit about my company. We have got 2 apps, and we have been using the Xamarin tool. Before it was called MonoTouch. It came from Mono, which was basically open source project started in 2002 by Miguel. And in about 3 years back, a little more than 3 years back, they came out with a beta, which is called MonoTouch, which will let you write C# on iOS. And we have got 2 apps in the App Store. One is which talks to Microsoft SSRS server, and one talks to SharePoint server, and we also have a cloud app out there. So I think one of the questions which a lot of people ask is like, hey, I mean, why Xamarin or why MonoTouch? Because there are lots of developer environments out there. And if you look at it, like on the native side, you have the Xcode with Objective-C, and then you have Java with Eclipse, which is what Google is kind of pushing. But in the middle, you have a lot of HTML5 and a whole lot of other environments kind of thing. And I think what I basically chose MonoTouch, was now it's called Xamarin.iOS and Android. That's pretty one reason. It's basically I just love C# and I've been using it, and I just have a lot of code and a lot of investment in C# kind of thing. And moving that code away to some other language and all is would be a big time-consuming thing. And also, from an investment standpoint, it didn't make any sense to like keep rewriting the same code for different platforms. And I mean, after using C#, I mean, you kind of things start growing on you, which are not available on other platforms, like things like Link and Async, which has come out right now. So let's talk a bit of what is Xamarin iOS and Android. And the best way to explain this is it's a platform and also a set of tools which lets you write C# and .NET programs and basically deploy it on iOS and Android devices. By the way, just feel free to interrupt me and ask questions, because it's easier to have a two-way conversations. Anytime if you feel like it. So, I mean, I don't know how many people have used Objective-C, but this is kind of like what Objective-C looks like. And it's kind of like a version of C with objects there. And if you are basically used to like C# and all, it does get a little difficult kind of thing. Plus, again, as I mentioned, the investments you have made don't kind of carry around that. With Java is obviously a lot more similar to C#, but it doesn't have things like Link or Async right now. So the stuff that you kind of got used to will not carry over to Java. So this is gives like a good overall slide on what Xamarin iOS does. Basically, because you're writing C# code, you basically can share it among multiple platforms, including Windows and Windows 8 in the Metro UI. And the way, and I'll explain to you what you can carry over and what you can't in a later slide. But it basically lets you this thing. The other thing to notice is that a lot of things is on native performance. And you might have read like, hey, LinkedIn and Facebook had written an HTML5 app and then went back to the current native apps on the native platforms. And when they say native UI, means you're basically using the UI libraries which a platform vendor has specified. Like if you're using a list, it is a list which either Google has written, or the UI collection view, or the UI table view controller which Apple has written. So you're basically using all the optimizations and animations which Apple has designed or Google has designed in the platform. You're not kind of simulating that whole thing with HTML. The other stuff which has come out right now, I mean, before, just last month, Xamarin has also got Visual Studio integration with iOS. They had it for Android earlier, but now they have iOS. You still need a Mac, and the way it works is Visual Studio is running on one machine, and the build server is running on a separate machine. But you can basically, you can look at your simulator on a separate machine, or if you're using a VM, you can look at it on the same machine. I'll demo that a little later.
Excuse me. Did you just say you will always need a Mac to use it?
You need a Mac to use this thing. But the way I do it is I run the Mac OS, and I run VMware, and I run Windows 8 on that thing, and Visual Studio inside that VM. They also have got some good designers. There's a designer in beta for iOS. They already have a designer for Android, and I'll show you some screenshots of that a little later. But one of the things which people like, oh yeah, I mean, is this different than what .NET is? And the answer is no. This is exactly what you would write this thing on .NET on Windows kind of thing. You basically see, you could basically use the same type of, call the same APIs, you call the same libraries. The whole .NET framework is kind of available to you to use. You have things like tasks and the parallel processing now with the new iPads and iPhones and Android devices having multiple cores. It makes life a lot more easier, because now what you do on your Windows platform on the .NET framework, you can also do it on the Xamarin platform under both iOS and Android. They also have, Xamarin is also supporting a version for the Mac right now. So if you want to write software for the Mac, that's another alternative. Basically, it's the same. You can use the same code. One thing to remember, and I'll talk about it in a future slide, is, okay, before that, let's see how this works. When you use .NET, it basically does something similar to the down, to the below what Android does. You basically compile and link stuff, and and basically using pinvoke, it talks to Win32 or Win64. And it basically creates an exe which actually consists of IL code, and it's just talking to the CLR to actually run it using the JIT compiler. And that's something similar what Android and Xamarin Android does kind of thing. It's like the exact same thing, except the bindings are not obviously to a Windows binding, but it's actually talking to the Java Android native APIs kind of thing. So basically what you're writing your C# code kind of thing, but you're actually calling the UI libraries. So you're not calling the WinForms or WPF code, but you're actually calling the Android libraries kind of thing to do stuff with this. And that's the main difference kind of thing. But in a sense, the technology is very similar. APK is the packaging format for Android. And when you basically, you upload your application to the App Store and to the Google Play Store, and then it basically runs natively. It's the exact same thing what happens when you're running .NET on Windows. On the iOS, things are a little bit different. iOS doesn't let any JVM or VM run kind of thing. So on the iOS, what Xamarin has done is that they use ahead of time compiler, which basically works similarly to like how a C++ compiler would do, and basically compiles the whole app into native code. And it creates the ARM binary. ARM is the platform architecture that Apple uses for both iPad and iPhones and the iPad mini or the iPod Touch. And it basically creates that binary, and that binary actually runs. The bindings again now for the Apple one is bound to the Apple UI library. So you see stuff like UI table view controller, UI collection view controller, and those kinds of APIs. So you're actually now talking to Apple APIs. So this is a main difference between a lot of stuff like when you see PhoneGap and Sensor Touch and other stuff. You're basically in those platforms. You're actually writing HTML code or HTML5 code with JavaScript, and you're actually calling a common API kind of thing for doing this, and using HTML to provide a UI along with CSS. Here what you're doing is you have APIs, but those APIs are not written by Xamarin, but they are other Apple APIs or Google's APIs for Android. And what happens is that the bindings do the translations. Now, this is very similar to what Microsoft does in .NET with Windows Forms. Windows Forms is native code. Even the Win 8 stuff, the WinRT, kind of the runtime layer, also is native code. And it basically uses, when you're writing a WinRT program, it basically uses the bindings to talk to this thing, and it makes sure calls and projections. Any questions on this? I mean, I just want to cover the fundamentals because I think that's very core to understanding how the XAML stuff is very different than PhoneGap or any other HTML framework or any other native framework.
Question right here.
Android has different, phones has different, what you call, resolutions.
Right.
How do you take care of that?
So basically, it's the same thing. What you, as a Java developer, what you would do, you basically would have to write your application without making an assumption on what your screen size is. I mean, you can make some like standard saying that this application would run like in a phone view, or this application would run in a like an iPad, like a tablet mode kind of thing. And that's a common problem in Android applications because there's so many varied platforms. You even see applications written by big companies which don't scale very well. I mean, you see the same application on the phone, and you just see a zoomed up version on the tablet, on Google's Android tablet. So basically from a developer standpoint, you are expected, and this is common to, if you're using the Android SDK, you need to do that. You need to check the size of your device and the resolution of device and decide like what kind of UI will you put. Like if for example, if you're writing a mail app, for example, you would basically on the iPhone you'll see that mail app just shows just the headers, and then you click on that, then it goes to the details. So you're seeing a master and detail on two different screens, right? I mean, you have to actually navigate. But on the iPad, what Apple does is that they sort of master on the left-hand corner and the details on the right pane kind of thing. But that's a work that as a developer you need to do, kind of saying that, hey, what kind of a device I'm running, what is the form factor of a device, and what is the resolution, and which UI and which layout should I use. So I think Android uses different layouts, and you basically choose the layout to decide what to actually display. And you'll say like, hey, this is a big tablet, so I'm going to sort of master the detail view on the same page, on the same screen, kind of, at the same time.
Eclipse, you have, in the project, you have low resolution, high resolution like that. You put the fonts
Right.
and the JPEG images corresponding to those screen width and screen size. So that will take care of automatically, depending upon the phone you are loading. If
Right.
you take that resolution, it will work like that. Whereas here, a user has to take care of this.
I believe, Greg, it's the same thing, right? I mean,
Yeah, it works exactly the same. Anything that you can do in the native platform, you can also do with Xamarin.Android. So if your resource folder has lots of different layouts with portrait and main screen, and XML, HTTPI, you can have exactly that same layout in Xamarin.Android. And the designer that we have available in Visual Studio and in Xamarin Studio lets you change those parameters. So it lets you edit the landscape and the portrait one, and it also reminds you if you make changes in one and not the other. So all of those resolution independent stuff works with our tools just the same as does in Java. We use the same XML format that Java uses for the screen layouts.
What about some native thing like there may be an accelerometer, there may be a GPS where you can access them separately? Can you get access?
All the native APIs are available just like that for C# objects.
Oh, C#.
Yeah.
So you can just put like IntelliSense like dot and then.
Yep, definitely.
Wow.
Yeah, I think Ash will probably talk about
Yeah,
that.
I will talk about that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Any other questions before we move on to the next slide?
How much is Xamarin?
The cost of the tool? So I think they have a free version now for this thing, and then they have another type for indie developers at what, $300?
Indie license for one developer is $299 per platform.
Okay. And then they have a business license for $1,000 or something like that, right? Any other questions?
Do you need a license if you have an integration server? Sorry, if you have an integration server, like you do continuous build, do you need a license on this machine?
Go ahead. Yeah, so the question was, can you use a build server? Do you need a license for the build server? So we have a just terms of service that just kind of clears just kind of the the standard Apple terms of service, because any iOS .app that's developed for an iOS app, Apple's terms of service does have to be compiled on a Mac build. So that's why you need a Mac for iOS. And so you can do all of your development on a Windows PC and Visual Studio using the Xamarin, Xamarin.iOS or Xamarin.android extensions. But then to compile and build, we do have a build server agreement that you have to complete to allow that infrastructure to be covered by our terms.
Yeah. So you need a license.
You need a license.
You need a license, a licensed developer to have build server.
You would also need to sign the terms of service in addition to it.
Yeah, so you're saying there's no performance penalty at all?
When it's actually running,
Yeah.
there's probably a minimal performance penalty, and because performance penalty comes in terms of size of the app, you just use the Xcode and Objective-C or the Java thing, those apps are smaller, but here because it's bundling parts of the .NET framework out there, the size of the app is bigger. In terms of speed performance, I don't think there's a lot of difference.
The performance difference is negligible because on iOS we're compiling down to instruction code. Like it's actually running native code. There's no interpreting. That's why it's AOT compiled. So we're actually doing all of that work. There's no interpretation happening at all at runtime in iOS. So there's flight simulators built on Xamarin for iOS and Xamarin for Android, which you just can't get performance to run a flight simulator if things are getting slowed down and being laggy.
Any other questions? So, I mean, let's talk about the APIs. And one of the questions was like, what kind of coverage you have? And it basically, Xamarin has right now the complete coverage of Apple iOS. So whatever APIs you see, what people, Objective-C developers are allowed to use from Apple, those things are kind of bound as C# objects kind of thing. It's basically a C# binding. Again, this is very similar to what WinForms binding is. From a profile perspective, I think we're close to the latest release. They're very close to .NET 4.5 client profile, minus the Windows-specific frameworks. And Windows-specific frameworks are things like Windows Forms, Enterprise Services, and WPF, and those kinds of things, where you would expect they kind of depend on some native code in Windows kind of thing, and doesn't make sense to kind of support them in this thing. Another thing which is not supported is, I think they have partial support for WCF in this thing. But besides that, I mean, when we have written our apps, we haven't seen any other issues. In fact, one of the funny things is that our app was actually running, the business app, as far as client app, was actually talking to Microsoft SQL Server reporting services, and that uses NTLM for authentication. And when Microsoft released Windows Phone 7, we tried to port an app, didn't work because Windows Phone 7 didn't support NTLM authentication. And a subset of what the framework that Windows Phone 7 was supporting was actually a subset of what Xamarin is supporting on this thing, the Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android. So it's a much bigger framework that you get to work with, even when considering it's a mobile platform with like very limited memory. One of the things Xamarin has done, and I believe this is still in alpha or beta, is that they got the C# async thing working, and this is kind of upgraded to Mono 3.0, which is kind of equivalent and mapping to the .NET 4.5 framework. So you can write your async code and kind of, if you're basically doing a lot, if you're writing an app which is talking to a lot of backend services, the async kind of helps a lot because, especially for exception handling, it becomes a lot more easier to take care of those kind of things. Other thing, if you have been an iOS developer, you might have probably written some Objective-C code or must have used some Objective-C libraries. And what Xamarin's answer to that is, you have wrapper APIs kind of thing. So you write like a wrapper API around this thing, which is kind of, you write your own bindings for the Objective-C controls. And the same way for the Java controls, you basically write kind of wrappers, and you can basically, if somebody has written an Objective-C control, you can basically use in your C# app, you can actually call the Objective-C control and do stuff with it. And then it comes back with your whatever the right results are. But so basically, the whole purpose of this entire thing is to kind of say that, hey, I mean, this is native, but with C# kind of thing. So whatever you can do with the native platform, and I think a lot of people ask me like, hey, what can't we do with this thing? And so far, I haven't found anything that you can do with the native APIs that you can't do with both these technologies, the iOS with C# and the Android with C#. Any questions on this thing, on the architecture? Good.
The first point, complete coverage of Apple iOS and Android SDK. How is that important for me as a .NET developer?
Because when you're basically writing code, you're basically writing code which talks to the Apple APIs.
Right, but I don't know Apple or Android SDK at all. I know .NET.
Right.
So is that important for me to know?
Yes, that's important because the UI layers are all Apple or the Android system. You have to know the Apple APIs.
I see.
Because, as I said, it doesn't support Windows Forms or no other, like if you were supporting Windows Forms, then you would say like, hey, you know, I don't really need to know the Apple APIs kind of thing. But then if you don't support Windows Forms, it would be very similar to the HTML5 solution where there's a non-native solution. So all the work that Apple has done in using basically speeding up animations using the GPU and the smooth scrolling and the bounce back, what you see in that when you scroll up this list, you lose all of that because you're not using the native libraries kind of thing. So all the UI nicely, which is very, I mean, you could probably do it with HTML5 maybe in the future once the browsers are making better use of the GPU and those things. But right now, I think those native APIs all support all that animations and all, which when you call the APIs to C# with this thing, you still are making use of the same API. So if you're familiar with writing this one big class in Apple's iOS is called a UI table view controller, which most of the apps use, and they're just it's basically like a list view kind of thing. So you basically subclass that and then populate that with your data, what data you want to show on the list. Any other questions?
So you need two versions, one for each platform?
Yeah, you need two versions, both from a licensing perspective also and from a knowledge perspective, because if you are writing, if you want to write an Android application, you need to know the Android APIs, the UI APIs. You can't use Apple APIs and write for the Android version. Okay. So there are two different products, and they are basically are targeting two different SDKs. One of the things, if you have used Objective-C and all, and before, I think before iOS 4, it was even more worse than that, but with iOS 4, they have this retained release kind of thing, which is not a garbage collector, but a compiler basically does reference counting, and it uses, the compiler tries to do the reference counting for you. But a lot of times when you see iOS applications like crashing, it's mainly because of memory issues kind of thing. They were accessing an invalid location of memory kind of thing. The nice thing about the Xamarin stuff is that it basically is using memory management because it's the same CLR kind of running that. Even when it's running on iOS, it's still using the garbage collector kind of thing. So you don't have to worry about things. Of course, you could still do weird stuff on that, but then you would have to take a lot of pains to do it. With Java and Android, it's not so much of an issue because Java is already supporting memory management. But if you're writing iOS code, I mean, the memory management is, I think, makes your software a lot more simple to write, and it helps in basically not releasing buggy software because you're basically using the best practices which are kind of built in, and you're basically letting the operating system kind of take care of all this stuff. Any other questions?
Yeah, you said that when you deploy this application, it's still going to use the garbage collector from your CLR.
Right.
That means even you're creating ARM binaries. On top of that, you are running some kind of framework,
right,
which is kind of native to Microsoft.
You're running a small part of the CLR, which is taking care of garbage collection. I understand. Because that's what you want, kind of thing. Because you have to use C# without a garbage collector, right? I mean, then it would become like C++, where you would have to do this thing. It would not make sense actually.
Yeah, and that's where I guess the whatever the performance difference you will see very negligible. You said.
Right.
Because you're not really using iOS, whatever they use for their native program to run.
Well, iOS also you have to do that stuff. It's just that you're doing it manually, right? I mean, you have to basically, when you're done with the object, you have to release it kind of thing. It's just that as a programmer.
They have their own way of doing it.
Yeah, you're basically, it's like what C++ was doing, right? You delete the object kind of thing. The problem is when you delete an object which doesn't exist, or you're, even worse, you're trying to use an object which you have deleted earlier kind of thing. So that makes this thing. But finally, somebody has to release memory. It's like either you're doing it manually or the garbage collector. So let's talk about what Xamarin has. And one of the tool sets is Xamarin Studio. Earlier this was called Mono Develop, and I think 2-3 months back Xamarin redesigned this and released this as Xamarin Studio. And they kind of use a nice looking like Apple styling, this kind of make it look more like Xcode. But this is the IDE that was there earlier kind of thing. It's like you would basically use this IDE to write applications and basically deploy applications to this. And this is the iPhone simulator. This is iPhone simulator, but you could also, the Apple SDK also has the iPad simulator. So you would basically use that to kind of deploy your applications to test in this. So this whole thing is running on a Mac kind of thing, the whole setup. So that's, and this is a full-fledged IDE. I mean, I wouldn't compare it to full-fledged to Visual Studio, but I think in the last 3 years, it has gotten better and better. Especially with like IntelliSense, and they have some amount of even refactoring built in, and also it has gotten a lot better over the last 3 years. But this is an IDE you would kind of, I mean, if you're just, if you were like 3-4 months back, this was the only IDE which was kind of available. But now they also support Visual Studio. So basically, the thing in that is that this picture is kind of slightly misleading in the sense is this one is running on the Windows, but this is the running on the Mac kind of thing. And you can do that via the VM, and I'll demo that later. But that's the, I mean, the whole idea is that by using Visual Studio, you get a whole ecosystem of Visual Studio tools, right? I mean, you get tools like Resharper and whatever, your TFS integration, and all the things that developers are used to kind of thing. And a lot of developers have been so used to using stuff in Visual Studio. Like I found it hard 3 years back to use Mono Develop, which was the precursor of Xamarin Studio, because it was just a different environment, the key bindings were a little different, and overall it was kind of a very different experience to use. And especially, I think my biggest pain point that time I couldn't use something like Resharper. So this is one of the big things which, and this is kind of still in alpha beta state.
Only, no, the iOS version of the Visual Studio was hard to Xamarin 2.0 launch last month.
Right.
So yeah, the only part that's
right,
and beta at the moment is the iOS design.
Right. So this, one thing to note about this, the Java version of the thing, the Xamarin Android kind of thing, which was actually earlier called Mono for Android, that used Visual Studio earlier kind of thing. So that was using Visual Studio since the start for about 2 years. Any questions so far? So this is a screenshot of the simulator. You basically have 2 different types of simulators, and again, everything on this thing is a part of Apple SDK. So it's and the reason I put the screenshot here is to kind of give you the feeling is like, so you can't you can't just download the Xamarin tools but not develop the iOS SDK or Xcode, because Xamarin uses the whole iOS SDK to actually basically compile and build stuff, and basically it's using their simulators to actually deploy applications in test mode, and so that you can test it and debug those. So it's like the integration level is quite deep. This is an example of screenshot of debugger. Basically, again, these are actually running on 2 different machines, and you basically are debugging on one machine kind of thing. And by using a VM, you can actually do it on the same, something like Parallels or VMware, which is what I use. how many people have actually deployed an app to the App Store? Anybody? App Store? So one of the things is Apple makes you go to a whole lot of, like then they have this thing called plist, which is a whole sort of settings. And one nice thing here is all these settings are simplified. So you have some nice UI, to specify what orientations might be supporting, what is the application name, and all that. You don't have to edit this plist file and look up the SDK and say what information I need here. And this is very important because every app which actually goes to you have to submit it to the App Store. And I think a lot of people don't realize is that there are only two ways to actually put an app for mass deployment. One is you put your app to an App Store. The other way is a little more convoluted. You get an enterprise license from Apple and then you develop an application which will only run in your enterprise and you have to distribute certificates and all. But the most common thing is you have to go to Apple to basically publish your app to the App Store. So, and Apple is very strict of that. I mean, you must have heard people having horror stories, and a lot of the horror stories are because they are not basically filled in the right information and all. There are few of them which Apple has said, I object to this content. But a lot of the horror stories are like, hey, they have not submitted the right information what Apple is using, Apple needs. And these kind of settings kind of help that. And the reason behind this thing, I mean, this is just sort of making the whole development experience nicer. Like to you, rather than making you go and figure out how to edit like a plist file, which is the file which Apple uses, it makes this nicer to have a settings. The same way they have a similar settings screen for Android, where it kind of helps you basically, like Google will make you specify when you have an Android application. It actually tells you like, oh, this application is using the phone, it's using contacts and all that whole list of things and all. But these things make the settings and all make it easier kind of thing to do those. This is a screenshot of Android Designer. You can basically put different kind of Android controls, and these are all controls from the Android. This thing you can drag and drop them, and then basically connect them, double click them. It's very similar to what the Windows Forms or WPF designers and most GUI designers kind of let you do. This is the iOS designer, and this is still in beta. So the whole idea is like earlier you had to use the Xcode designer to actually design stuff, and then jump over to the Mono developer Xamarin Studio, Visual Studio doesn't support this thing. But the whole idea is here now you have an integrated experience from basically using Apple's UI developer tools, UI designer tools rather, in one application kind of thing, rather than basically making it jump to Xcode and back again. Any questions on this so far? So let me talk about this, and I think of all the coolest things, I think this is a really cool stuff kind of thing. I mean, for a lot of folks here who have been using .NET are very familiar with NuGet, which is a package manager where you basically say NuGet, I want to basically get this package like JSON.NET, or like I use like Service Stack, this thing. So I just say NuGet and this thing. What Xamarin has done is that, and this is a lot of feedback from early developers, that we were kind of struggling thinking that, you know what, it would be nice if there's a component library, something like NuGet for Xamarin kind of. So what Xamarin has done is they've taken it one level further kind of thing. So not only they have a component library, this thing where you can have something like a package manager with NuGet, but they also have a component store. And the component store basically lets developers write small components, submit them, and basically one click, and I'll demo this later in my demo, to basically add it to your entire application kind of thing. So it basically allows you to now build up an application just just buying components kind of thing. And it's all integrated with the developer environment, and it also does some cool things. Is like it lets you like actually see the component, has some sample code for integration, and then which you can basically copy and paste right there. Again, probably I would say like you would kind of think of this as like a next version of NuGet combined with facility to actually do e-commerce and actually buy a component. And I think the last thing for my slides, and I'm done with the slides after this, is the documentation team. And the documentation team has really this thing. I mean, I think when 3 years back, it was really hard to get any kind of documentation. And I constantly had to go like search on Google, go to blogs like Craig's stuff and say that, hey, how do you do this in monotouch kind of thing. But I think since Xamarin was formed, it's like one of the things is like to focus on the complete developer experience. And if you look at the documentation, I would say that it rivals even MSDN kind of thing. In the sense is that they've done a lot of work in providing like good step-by-step guides and saying, how do I do this, how do I do that? And that basically lets you get started in a very easy manner. So I'll go to the demo after a break, and then we'll proceed. Any other questions?
Are there any benchmarks between the code and
So this is a Mac, this thing running Mountain Lion, which is the latest version of the OS. It's also running VMware, and I'm running Visual Studio in a Windows this thing under VMware. VMware also allows you what is called Unity mode, where it will basically have all apps running in their own separate windows, and basically you can run them as like native Mac apps kind of thing, but actually doing a screen sharing between. But I kind of like all my Windows application, my Windows box kind of thing. And this is where you kind of see the Windows box. This is the VMware application. Windows is running there. It's running Visual Studio 2012. And this has the Xamarin stuff installed, kind of thing, the business edition installed out here. So the way to start with this, and you can do the same thing if you just have a Mac without Windows with the Xamarin Studio kind of thing. So you don't really need Visual Studio, but everybody in this room is probably has a copy of Visual Studio, so we'll basically demo that. So basically I do the same thing. I do Windows project, and I can do this thing. I can do my Android application, so I can basically do an iOS application now here. So I basically say that, hey, I want like an iPhone application and a Hello World application. Okay. And this machine also, it should also have ReSharper installed. So and ReSharper also works with IntelliSense and with the Xamarin, this thing to basically help me write the application. So basically, this is where I have my application, and this is I just ran the project, the new project, and this is what I got. And I'll just quickly run through this thing. So if you noticed, basically, this part, what you see out here is.
Can you get the font?
Is that better?
Yeah.
So this part here is again your normal .NET stuff, what you're using, your system collections and all that stuff. And here's what you see. Basically, the bindings are there. So there's a monotouch foundation, which is the non-UI portion, which you deal with the Apple SDK, and the UI kit is the binding for UI kit, and Apple calls the UI windows and all namespace is a UI kit library kind of, the UI kit framework. So that's what they basically have out here. So this is your main application. You basically have a main method, and basically you're saying that, oh, I want to run this delegate called app delegate kind of thing. And then you go to the app delegate class. And this is, again, I've not done anything. I just done a new project wizard. So I'm just explaining you what's there. Let me zoom this up. So here it's like when you see an app delegate class, this is again, if you're writing an iOS application, actually you see all this the same stuff, because it's the same kind of binding which the Apple APIs are basically forcing you to use. So you have the app delegate, and you have like a UI window, and then Apple uses thing of MVC pattern for this thing. So you have a UI controller, and in the controller there's a view, and then you basically provide your class which provides the data into it. And what you do basically, so basically the thing is that when the app launches the first time, you basically create your own window, create your UI controller, main UI controller, that's what's happening here. And then you basically say that, assign it to the root UI controller, saying that this is the root of the chain. So you must have noticed if you use the iPhone and all, there's an application, there's a navigation. So that's, you start at the root view controller and then you navigate your way through to the entire. And the last line is also saying make it the key window and make it visible. In my UI controller, I basically am, it's just the same thing, it's basically saying that, load this thing and basically put a button called click me, and when it's clicked, we basically have a delegate thing. So this is actually very similar to, like, if you have written Windows Forms code, you basically would write something like that if you're not laying out the controls. This thing. And the only difference is that instead of using the Windows Forms API, it's using Apple's API. So you're basically calling Apple's SDK out here. So, I mean, so basically when I run this, so right now it's trying to talk to the host computer, which is this thing. So sorry, I don't have a phone connected. I'm running the alpha version, and there's a regression bug which I kind of happen to hit, but I don't want to update the whole machine. So there will be times when I have to exit Visual Studio. Right now we expect it to run. So if you notice, let me demo you the Android version. There's some issue. So for the Android version also, I basically go and do the same thing. For some reason it's having an issue talking to my host machine.
Yeah, so
Okay. So this is, again, let me go to how the Android version is different. So this is again, this is using the this Google's Android SDK kind of thing. So you basically an app, Google has this concept of activities, and you run different activities, and then you pass information between each activity. And this is the main activity. Basically, you say the main launcher. So basically, you kind of say that this is the main launcher which will launch this activity. And on this thing, I have like a Nexus simulator. Android chips with different simulators, and you can also create your own device simulator. You say, my device is of this size and this resolution. But this is the simulator which is basically set up for the Nexus size. So right now it's kind of building it for the Android version. Basically, Android has, one of the issues with Android is you have to choose what version of Android you have to stick. And you would install the SDK for that particular version out there. And once it's built, then you can basically run your device. I know some reason there's this thing. So it's installing the when you deploy it the first time, and you basically install this is a first time deployment. You're basically installing the Mono API package, but this is for the API 16 framework, which was a 4.1 framework. And it basically installs that, and then after that it will basically run the application. But this is a one-time setup only.
With Mono, is that application, the runtime installed for every application, or is it shared?
I think you had a choice with that earlier, right? Greg, earlier. Now, are we doing shared or?
The shared, you can enable a shared runtime just for debugging, so that when you're doing a compile test debug side, when you want it to be really fast, we put the shared runtime, like it is on your PC, just up once, and then you can download really small apps that just consist of the additional app IL, and they can all share that same runtime for you to test and debug apps on your own devices on the simulator.
And you also have that option of like embedding the runtime.
When you embed it, when you're deploying to Google Play or building an APK that you're going to distribute, it will always embed the runtime. So you'll never distribute a standalone runtime that the user will ever see in their application list. So the shared runtime is just for making the development experience faster.
I wasn't impressed when I already installed this, but for some reason it's reinstalling this. But again, this is it's almost halfway through. Any questions on this time, because this will take another couple of minutes.
When you are in the code editor, if you over any kind of member, do you have documentation on those?
Yes. So let me just go to the activity. Entire button, and basically IntelliSense, and this is resupposited IntelliSense, which is actually popping up now. But it basically kind of works, and I can basically now see the entire API.
Yeah, you just see the signatures. Do you have like the documentation?
Yes. You mean the actual parameters?
So website or?
If I call method from the .NET framework, I have the documentation in my...
Yeah, so
Your
documentation
phone,
is
your phone,
partially
so that-
complete for both iOS and Android, like it's something that we're working through. When you've got other like tools in Visual Studio, they can block the documentation coming up. If you're in Xamarin Studio, the documentation always appears after the IntelliSense, so that was something we introduced into Xamarin Studio a couple of weeks ago, is as well as the autocomplete bubble below, the documentation bubble comes up to the right. So that gives you that documentation you're expecting that's in the summary tag and the XML parameter tags, that stuff all comes through. And the reason why it isn't all there right now is because we're writing all that from scratch. Like we're not just, well, we wouldn't copy Apple's or Google's documentation over it explains how individual classes work. We're actually writing documentation for every class and method in both APIs to make sure that it's relevant to C# releases. So we start with the most
really good. Almost felt like the backlight is not turned on. It's emulated.
Yeah, this is emulated. So. Basically, this is the application kind of thing, which is this thing, and I can basically go here, find it, and go here and basically put a breakpoint and say that, hey, when this button is clicked, I basically want it to this, because that's what the button. It's a click handler button.
You enlarge it?
Oh yeah, sorry. Basically, I got a breakpoint on the click handler, and here when I basically go and click on the debugger, I will basically go and break in my breakpoint, and you can see this button text is going to be changed now. So again, it's basically the same experience you get. I mean, if you have been writing Windows Forms and application, WPF applications, any UI application, the experience is very similar, except you have to know whichever platform's native APIs if you're talking to. But if you notice that things are very similar, it's like there's a click handler for buttons, which is generally what UI, I mean UI frameworks kind of support. Any other questions this time?
What's your recommendation of which Android framework to pick from? Is good legacy support and future support?
That's a very good question. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that, because it depends on who your target audience is. I mean, if you're basically targeting people with newer devices, then selecting 4.0 and above makes a lot of sense, because you're saying everybody has. But if you want to basically get the widest possible market, you kind of go to 2.3 or 3.0 kind of thing. If you want to support the old honeycomb tablets, which was the first tablets that Google came out with. But finally, I think that's one problem in the Android thing. So one thing is that you still have to deal with, when you're writing a mobile app, I mean, Xamarin takes care of making the app using C++ to write the app, and that's what they do, make it extremely easy to do. But you still have to figure out like, hey, I mean, who do I have, I mean, who are the customers of this app, who's going to pay for it, and what are the devices that it's going to run. With Android, the problem also becomes is that since there's so many different versions of Android, you're going to have to deal with support calls. It's like, hey, I paid for your app, it doesn't work on my device. So you have to deal with those issues. But the thing is, I think newer versions, especially after 4 and 4.1 and 4.2, are a lot better than the 2.0 and previous generation. So like, I think I would target, personally, I would target 4.0 and above. But again, it depends on your other thing to decide like where you're going to go.
There's a question right here.
If you decided I'm going to support Android at this point forward and nothing later, in their store, can you block installation to older versions?
Yeah, I think you can basically specify what version you're using of Android, and that with the project, when you build a project, you kind of specifying that in the settings, kind of this thing, and saying I want the minimum version is Android 4.1 right now. You also may need to make sure for each version you have the corresponding Android SDK installed for that particular version.
But there's nothing in their store that'll say do not install on Android versions prior to.
I think Google prevents you from doing that, because the metadata of the app and the Play Store will not basically show your app to people who are not on that version kind of thing. If you're browsing it.
So there's something there.
Yeah, the Google Play Store actually has a lot of app targeting to help you with stuff like that. So in addition to using the metadata in the app, it has a minimum version, which it's just not going to let you put it on a device with less than that.
Okay.
But Google Play Store also lets you upload multiple APKs that target different device levels or different device capabilities. So you can choose screen size, or you can choose like processor type or something as an axis, and upload 2 APKs, one for one for the other. It means you've got to support them going forward, but you could have one for 2.2 and not 3.0.
Sure.
Okay. There's a lot of not a lot of people use it that I've ever seen, but if you open the advanced settings when you're deploying that, you can upload multiple APKs and go to town with all sorts of customizations.
Good. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think Google gives a lot of this thing, but the flip side of that is, and you have to take care of all these different devices, and testing becomes a big issue on that. especially people are complaining that, oh, your software doesn't work on my device, and you don't have that device. On the iOS platform, they're just iPad mini now, which is kind of the same as iPad, and iPhone, and iPod Touch, which is very similar to iPhone. So it's really you're dealing with two main devices for that. And Apple releases the OS almost once a year, so you don't have to deal with that many OS updates also. So basically this is, this is what you get in Android, you could use. But I wanted to show you the iOS thing, especially the component store, because that's what we're listening to. Let me open the project which I had written before. Hopefully cross our fingers and that will come there. So from the component store, let's do this. So if you want to add a new component, and I talked about a component store, so you get more components, and it goes to the component store and lets you basically look at all the different components. And you have the Azure mobile services for Microsoft. So if you want to use Azure as your backend and still connect to the Xamarin, this can go to iOS and Android, you can still do it. And the nice thing about this is it's like a kind of a developer store. And it basically, you kind of basically can also put in data, which is kind of what NuGet does. And for NuGet, you have to do it, you basically do NuGet and then you have to do stuff here. But here it's kind of integrated like in an app store kind of this thing. So basically you can specify data. And so what I've done before on this app is that I have, there was this nice component and they are specified into, classified into UI this thing, and somebody had a question on the non-UI components. That's also there, like the cloud services is out here too. Let's go to the UI. So there's this nice component called flyout navigation, which anybody who has used Facebook on the iPhone will probably just recognize. And it basically lets you just swipe stuff on the left kind of thing. So the thing to do, and I've already done it on this one, is that you install. You basically just say install component. Now it's already installed, and it will basically install it, and then there's a nice sample here which you can basically copy and paste stuff out there. So that's what you basically get to do. So let's try to run that app directly. So this is the stuff. This is the thing which I copied, and basically here's zoom it in. So besides the UI kit and this thing, you also see the flyout navigation, which was the namespace of the component out there. And basically, I basically just copied and pasted the stuff what is this, and I said, hey, I want to create 3 main pages here, and one page is a map and vegetable and minerals. And then basically, I want to assign them to different UI view controls. As I said, UI view controllers is the navigation thing. So I specify that, hey, for the first page, go to the map view controller. For the second page, just go to a UI view controller with just UI label, which is just a text label out there. So it just shows you there's a text label. Let me run this app. I'm not sure what exactly happened in the previous one. Just didn't. So basically this is like again, if you have seen the Facebook thing, you basically can navigate it back and forth. Let's ignore the map for now. I'll talk about it. And you basically have this nice slide out component. Now this basically took about maybe a minute or two to just go find a component in the App Store and just integrate it. So it's just not a lot of work. And I think that's the nice thing of the component store. I think allow people to a quick, much quicker integration. And also allow developers to make some money of writing components. And like I said, the other view controllers were just like, they just have plain text. There's a text label, the UI label, as Apple calls it, the UI label class. And then if I want to go back, I go there. So one of the things which I changed is I added a map view controller. And the reason I want to show you this is that it has async in it. You can see async running on this stuff. And this stuff. So basically, as I said, like we have a map view controller, which is again subclassing UI view controller, which is the Apple class for showing UI views. And one thing you notice here is that there's this new API which is available in .NET 4.5, which is HTTP client, and it's an async API. So basically, I say that hey, create a client and get a string, and this thing will work in .NET 4.5. So I'm getting the string in with the async thing, and it's returning me the task for that. And at the same time, I'm saying, hey, build me a map view. And with what the build map view, and I'll show you the code later, it basically says that, hey, show the map control on the iOS view controller, enter the view. And then basically I say that, hey, once I get a view, for my current view, add that as a subview, so I can see the view in this. And when I say add map points, you notice I'm using the await keyword, which is again a C# 5.0 feature, which you can basically say that, hey, I'm doing async. So the previous method of doing this, and I have not wrapped this in a try catch block, but there would be only one try catch block for this. The previous way of doing this, obviously, everybody has done is like you call the URL, pass a callback to it, like suppose you're using web client, you say download completed and pass the event handler for that. And when the download was completed, you would do stuff, or if download failed, you would do some additional stuff. So you would have to write three exception handlers for this thing. So this stuff makes it nice and clean. It's obviously a lot of people who wrote Windows 8 apps are probably using this. I think Microsoft forces you to use the Windows 8 app. But the nice thing about this is that you can use the same things what you're using out there, out here kind of thing. So you can basically move your same code. Like if you have business logic which has been developed using the whole async thing with async and await, you can directly bring that code here without this. So as I said, I wanted to show you the build a map view, which is just, it actually does one thing, it creates the map view and basically assigns it the sizing, which is nothing major going on there. And so when I basically get the data here, the data is an XML file, and this is a standard this thing, .NET code kind of thing, where I'm using link and saying that, hey, for this XML file, you create me a class called mkPoint annotation, and basically give me an array of that, this thing. And basically I'm doing a projection on that and basically then converting it to an array, and then saying that, hey, add this array back to this. So this is again, you probably have written, if you use link, you have written code like this 1,001 times, probably more than that. But the whole idea is that, again, this part is the part which is dealing with this thing is you can put it, and this is a sample app, but you kind of put it in a separate library as like a portable library, and you can then reuse it on the Android platform, on the Windows 8 platform, or Windows Phone platform, or on the iOS platform. So that's the whole goal. And I believe, like as Greg said earlier, maybe in a month or so, they'll have their portable library up and running. But right now, I mean, you can still do it right now. You just have to have multiple projects for this thing. But the source code will still be the same. So you can have you have source code compatibility now. But in the future, I think with portable libraries, will have this thing runtime code also. So you can just ship one library to the project. So you. The same this thing, IntelliSense, or everything applies here. It's like if I want to basically say, like for example, the map view is this thing. You can say I get my whole index IntelliSense and add a manual annotation, things like that. So again, what I have found that like initially it was when I started with 3 years back, it was not that this polished, but now it's like, I mean, you wouldn't see a lot of difference. I mean, if you're writing a Visual Studio app, it will still feel native to writing Visual Studio apps. The only thing is that you'll need, if you're writing iOS, you'll need a Mac, and you'll have to run a VM, or you'll need 2 machines to do it. You need a Mac machine to run your build. This thing. When the application was running in a Mac, so even if it's like it's in the same screen space, there are actually 2 machines running here. This is running to a Mac, and this is in a virtual machine running under VMware. Any questions on this thing? I wanted to go step by step, but there was some weird issues there. So any questions on this? Go ahead.
What kind of UI framework do you support? So you use Mono. Yeah.
Right.
So you can use Cocoa.
Yeah, so Apple uses, if you're using Xamarin.iOS, it uses the Cocoa Text framework, which is a subset of the whole Cocoa API, because I think the Cocoa API was primarily designed for Mac. So they have a smaller subset which they call the iOS API, which is shipped with the iOS SDK. Any other questions? I've got a couple of more slides just to wrap up. So just to wrap up, it's like best way to get started, go to Xamarin.com. You can just go download the stuff for this thing. And there's a trial version free and available, and also there's a free version also available if you're writing small apps kind of thing. You can try that out. As Steve mentioned, I'm actually talking on, we have already also built cloud apps, and one of the cloud apps is running on Windows Azure, and using ASP.NET and a technology called Service Stack. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar. And we use a JavaScript framework called AngularJS, which is actually from Google. It's an open source framework, and I'll be talking how to write cloud apps with that stuff. We also have another product coming out, and if anybody is an iOS developer, Android, or even a Windows 8 developer, if you guys want to be a beta user, we're looking for that actively. And we do some enterprise consulting, and we have a free 30-minute architecture session if you guys are interested. Any questions?
What about the sensor, accelerometers, those kind of support?
Everything is covered for this thing, on the API, this thing. Whatever is accelerometer which iOS, this thing exposes is exposed to the Xamarin API. Xamarin also has some stuff which, let me go here. There's stuff called Xamarin Mobile. This thing, which basically, like for example, for non-UI logic, it kind of encapsulates all the different things. For example, if you want to access as a compass accelerometer, it's different in Android, it's different in iOS. So this library, if you use this library, you're writing the same API for both iOS and Android. So it's like kind of like a wrapper API around both the libraries. The same for like contact, geolocation, camera, and other. Any other questions? Okay, thank you guys. team is collecting the eval forms and there's some